Unlike my usual updates, which focus solely on reporting the news, the following is a podcast that I recorded with a very good friend of mine, Rabbi Daniel Levine. In the podcast, we talk about news sources. What news sources do I rely on? Why do I rely on these news sources versus others when I report the news? Anti-Semitism and the United Nations and how the United Nations looks at the conflict, Israel and Iran, Hezbollah and its position in Lebanon. And we also touch upon the topic of total victory in the war and the future of Hamas and, to some extent, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think.
Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. I'm excited to welcome back Professor Alon Burstein, who just finished up his 3-year tenure at UC Irvine. He will be starting at Tufts in the fall. Just a little background about Alon. He has a now viral YouTube channel at Alon Burstein, where he gives daily, sometimes weekly updates and summaries about what's happening in the war. And it has truly been my really first and at some points only source of news coming out of the conflict, especially when I feel that I get bogged down in a lot of the detail, which is something that I'm going to ask you. But Alon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Daniel. Always good to be here with you.
And to anybody coming to this podcast through Alon's YouTube channel and are interested in listening to more of my podcasts, the title is called J Life with Daniel. You can find it on Spotify, on Apple, and on YouTube. So I wanted to start with the last several months. One of the things that we were talking about behind the scenes before we started recording is questions of general epistemological basis. Now, I'm not going to throw you into dialectical philosophy, but in terms of political epistemology, we're in a very interesting situation that's only been exacerbated by the Israeli-Gaza war, where it is almost impossible to know what's true. We can talk about big picture questions such as, is there a famine in Gaza? Of course, the UN came out and said they were dangerously close to famine levels, and I'm seeing all over pro-Israel, quote unquote, social media saying that that was made up. And I'm sitting here sort of in the middle, and this is just an exemplar of hundreds of other situations, and I have no idea who to trust. I'm seeing things on social media. I'm seeing Hamas put things out. I'm seeing the UN. I'm seeing the Israeli government, the American government. How are you, as somebody who really does his homework in terms of digging down to the actual numbers, the truth, quote unquote, how are you approaching this? Where are you going towards news sources? How are you ranking which to trust?
So it's a great question. I will say that, first of all, this is not unique to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israel-Hamas war, specifically when the latest big war was Russia-Ukraine, and the reporters who came out from there, these are reporters who covered the war on terrorism, the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, ISIS. They all said this was the hardest war to cover. We have no idea what is going on. We cannot trust any reports that are coming out. So this is a growing phenomenon that is very hard to cover what happens in war zones, and you don't know who to trust. It's not unique to the situation. This situation is a little bit different for a couple of different reasons. When it comes to my sources and who do I trust, it's very difficult. And the first thing I do is distinguish between things that describe what's going on and definitions. For example, X amount of people, and we could talk about how many people, X amount of people have been killed. That's that's a fact, that we killed in the war. Now, is this a genocide or is it not a genocide? It depends, first of all, what you're asking. Definitionally, if the UN says this is genocide, not genocide, there I look at what are the definitions of genocide. Because it could constitute a genocide, and also what happened in Russia and Ukraine could constitute a genocide. Maybe yes, maybe no. But I look at who is saying that. Is that someone on the ground who is saying we're being genocided? Or is that someone who's trying to adhere to a certain definition? And the reason I bring that up is because that's with the question of famine. There could be hunger in Gaza. There could be famine. When the UN puts out there's famine, not famine, that means has this reached a certain definition by the UN that matches what is famine? The fact that famine sounds worse than hunger or genocide sounds worse than killed, these are things that are evocative and make us feel, wait a minute, who's saying that? Is it true? Is it not true? But it's important to, first of all, see why are people actually using this definition or not. So first thing I look at is who is saying it? Is it the UN? Is it the International Court of Justice? Is it the ICC? Okay, then they're not trying to say it's worse or better. They are asking, does this meet a legal classification or not? And then if it's not them, if it's a reporter on the ground, if it's an actor in the conflict, the Israeli government, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, then already you have to start considering, okay, who do you trust? Who do you not trust? And this really, unfortunately, has to go on a case-by-case basis. There are literally ministries within the Hamas government who I trust more than other ministries in the Hamas government. There are statements put out by the Israeli government that I trust more than statements put out by other ministries within the Israeli government. So unfortunately, this is what makes it so difficult. It's really a case-by-case basis at that point.
So for your average person that is not taking the time and, doesn't even know there are different ministries within both the Israeli or Hamas, right? Let's just pick somebody, your average American perhaps, is even quite knowledgeable about the conflict. I'm not talking about people that have never heard about Gaza until 9 months ago. Somebody who's relatively involved and wants to stay updated and wants to sort of go past the black and white binary social mediaification of course this is a genocide, or of course this is, just the most moral, war tactics we've ever seen. What would you recommend to them? I mean, should they not look at the news almost, because that's obviously being refracted through a couple of ways? I mean, aside from obviously subscribing to your YouTube channel, I
Of
mean,
course.
how would you coach somebody who wants to genuinely figure out what's going on, but just feels so piled on by all of this misinformation? And I will add, I mean, you didn't necessarily say this, and you can let me know if you, like always, if you agree or disagree, or if you're somewhere in the middle. Some of this is, perhaps accidental misinformation, but some of this is also actors such as China and India and Iran purposely putting in misinformation. In the case of, say, India and China, it's not even necessarily misinformation in one direction or the other. There was a fascinating analysis that showed that India was responsible for hundreds of Twitter accounts on both sides of the conflict, extremely right-wing pro-Israel and extremely, I'll call it far-left anti-Israel accounts that were both being run by the same troll farms in India just to sow misinformation within the West, right? This is, similar to what happened, during the 2016 election. I'm sure it'll be much worse in the election coming up in 2024. But we have so many layers of just the general fog of war that makes it difficult, plus purposeful misinformation being pumped in, plus just the emotions of a conflict that, even separate than misinformation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has always been two completely different views that in some way is a zero-sum game, people trying to fight narrative. So, last question sort of on this general epistemology, then we'll get to specifics, but is there a couple of practical tips that you would give listeners to figuring this out?
So the first thing I would say is remember to look at what the actual facts are trying to be reported. I'm not even now. I'll talk in a minute about if sources are lying about facts, but what are the facts that are trying to be reported versus the stories that are being told? Very, very, very often, what we hear is, especially on social media, is heartbreaking stories from the ground, and then they are linked to a larger narrative. So we hear about a tragic story that occurs in the hospitals in Al Shifa Hospital, where there really were some amazingly harsh tragedies of babies dying of malnutrition and things like that. That story is told, and then it's linked to the ongoing genocide. So wait a minute, that story could be true. Again, we'll talk about how we try to decipher, but like the story on the ground can be true. Using that story to then often justify more grand statements is something that I would caution against on both sides. And we see on both sides that Hamas is A, B, and C, and they're all starving the Palestinians, and they're all this and all that. Therefore, Israel doesn't want to let aid in, or something like that. Like the links between some sort of like evocative story that may or may not be occurring on the ground, and saying, and therefore believe this fact because I just told you an emotional story, is something I really warn against. Distinguish between the stories that are important. We should know what's happening on the ground, and we should hear the tragic stories, but distinguish between that and how any news item then justifies, therefore believe this fact because now you're emotional. Now you feel that. That's point number one. Point number two, it's important to remember that all things that are told in a one-sided manner are not telling the whole story. The fact is that in any conflict, I'm not even saying there's good people on both sides, bad people on both sides. I'm just saying factually, in any conflict is messy. War is messy. It is very, very uncommon to have a situation during a conflict where one side is doing everything it can to be just and right, and the other side is just an enemy and just a villain, and everyone on one side supports the villain and everyone on the other side supports the heroes. Generally speaking, the more news items and the more stories present to you a one-sided picture of this is the only thing, then the only righteous side versus the wrong side, I caution against taking those facts. Usually things are far more complex, far more detailed And I'm not saying you have to get into the details. It's okay to remain on the surface level, but remember that there's more to the story. Don't just take the surface level and say, okay, now I know everything that's going on. It's okay to not know. I keep on telling my students, I taught a class on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I told my students, the tragedy of your generation is none of you are allowed to say, I don't know. I don't know about Gaza. I don't know about the conflict. I don't know who's right or wrong. I don't know about the occupation. I don't know about the settlements. You don't, but you shouldn't have to know everything about that. Do you know everything about the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Do you know everything about the crisis in Ethiopia and Tigray? Like, it's okay. It's okay not to know. But because people feel that it's not okay, you take the surface level news and you say, okay, now I know everything. So first, remember there's more details, more information. The second thing I'll say is try to get news sources that are looking at different sides. You don't have to come from different sides. You don't have to get a Palestinian news source and an Israeli news source. But different sources look at different things. Some look at the military operation and even if they're talking about the tragedy of what's happening in Gaza, they're looking at it from the military operation standpoint. Some are looking at it from the people on the ground standpoint. Try to look at least two different news stories, not coming from the same news feed, not coming from the same social media account, in order to just see if there's a different way to present certain things. Those are like the tidbits coming, if you don't want to get into the very, very in-depth, which ministry do you trust, which news sources do you trust, which this, which that. The one thing I will say is if you are looking at news sources that are known to be more sympathetic to one side, when I do my daily reports, I look at Israeli news sources, Palestinian news sources, and international news sources. Whenever I'm looking at the Israeli news sources, I trust a lot more the items that do not make the Israeli side look good. Similarly, whenever I look at Palestinian news sources, I trust a lot more the facts that they bring if they're not making the Palestinian side look good.
Just to push back on that one point of political epistemology, there is a clear drop off to that logic, because let's say we take a country such as let's compare America to Iran or to North Korea, right? An even more extreme example, right? And I'm just arguing from extreme examples here, right? It's my background in Talmud. I apologize. You could say in North Korea, there is nothing in any type of media that ever criticizes it. And so would you just say then, and let's say similarly to reports coming out of Hamas, is that just a blanket, okay, so I will never trust anything coming out of this government? I mean, is it even possible to figure out, quote unquote, North Korea is a far less emotional example for a lot of people than Gaza. Israel, because it's a generally more liberal country, allows freedom of speech, freedom of press, although obviously that is different than American freedom of speech and freedom of press in a whole variety of ways, a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation. Does that ipso facto make everything that Israeli news publishes, even the positive stuff, perhaps more believable? Because, well, there's actually a process and a freedom here that in a government that represses journalists. Do you see what I mean there?
I see what you mean, but there's two things that I'll add, and these are more in context of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. First of all, yes, it's true that Israel certainly has laws of freedom of press that do not exist under the Hamas government. Um, However, there's still certain things, even in the language that is used, in the language that is used in the Israeli press, any Palestinian who the army says is a suspect of terrorism, if they're reported killed, in the press it says a terrorist was killed. So that's just like in the language, in the nuance, even though it's freedom of press, there's no proof that the person wasn't in court. They may have not even done anything. The military suspected, therefore the media reports a terrorist was killed. That's within the purview of freedom of press. But you can see nuances of if it makes Israel look better or worse when it's coming from even from a free press. You can see, okay, but is it trying to be more accurate or less accurate? Is it just using these nuances or those nuances? Now, in terms of do we do we just not trust things coming out of, for example, North Korea, or what Russia was saying about the invasion of Ukraine, or what Hamas says? It's an interesting question. Very often I get criticized because I often bring what Hamas says. And I say, yes, but in this case, I would not advise people, yes, go believe everything that the Hamas government says. In the same way as I would not advise people go believe anything that an IDF soldier on the ground says about what all the IDF is doing. It's these things are not always believable. People have a reason that they're saying things. But I will say that very often one of the things, and this does require a lot more in-depth detail, and attend and like me devoting your life to it. So I'm not advising people do it, but for example, why very often it is possible to listen to what Hamas or Hezbollah or they say, because once you follow these groups very closely, you also start to understand their logic and why they're doing certain things. And I'll give you an example. 2 days ago, I published a summary, a June summary, what happened in the month of June. And I said, Hamas said during the month that 3 hostages were killed in an IDF bombing. They did not name any names. And then a week later, they said that 2 hostages were killed in Rafah in IDF bombing. And I said, I caution against believing the second video that Hamas put out. It did not look as believable. Now, why is that? That is because I have followed all the videos that Hamas has put out since the war began, and I have seen that up until now, every time they have said a hostage was killed in captivity, within about 2 to 3 months, the IDF confirms that a hostage is in fact dead. Now, that doesn't mean that Hamas saying they were killed in an IDF bombing is necessarily accurate. I don't believe everything they say, but I do say, you know what? So I start to believe when they put out videos of this nature. Up until now, they don't appear to be lying. They would not be in their interest to lie about this also. Then I saw that other video they put out, and I was like, that video was edited by someone else. This is not their official video. It's saying that it is, but I can see that it's not using the same type of language. It's not using the same type of imagery. So all of a sudden, I believe that a lot less. Now, yes, when it comes to, for example, the IDF spokesperson, I will not go through all of this. The IDF spokesperson is a much more regulated bureaucracy. I don't think that they have a different person pretending to be them. So yes, obviously, I treat what comes out from Hamas, or I would treat what will come out from Russia or from North Korea, differently than I do a military and a bureaucracy and an administration that is, at least trying to keep up to a certain standard. So obviously, it is within context. That said, though, I do not strike off. We can't believe anything that any of these regimes say, because you very often, if you follow them, you see, okay, but I understand their interests. They don't want to lie about this. They have never lied about this, and they probably don't want to. Could they? Sure. That is how I treat them.
Yeah. The other thing that's sort of lurking in the ether, and this is something I know we've talked about before, so you can, either say you want to move on or we can get bogged down in this for a couple of minutes before moving on, is in terms of at least the international media coming out, or even you had an example that was striking that, most students feel like they're not allowed to say, I don't know to this, whereas if they're asked about what's happening in Ethiopia, I would hope most of them say, I don't know. I mean, personally, I don't know either, is because anything that has to do with a Jewish state sort of implicates this multi-thousand-year tradition of anti-Semitism that's somewhat baked into the way that at least people in the modern world think about the only Jewish nation state. This, of course, does get into conversations of how much anti-Semitism is wrapped up in what the UN says or the International Criminal Court or anything there. How much does that play a role in, if the UN says something about Israel, do you treat that differently than if the UN were to come out and say something about Russia and Ukraine?
I do not, because I do not look at international anti-Semitism as the main source for the fixation on Israel or Israel-Palestine. There is a fixation on Israel-Palestine. That's a fact. There's a fixation on Israel. The UN Council on Human Rights has a dedicated session to Israel. The Palestinians are the only population in the world that have their own refugee agency. There's one refugee agency for the entire world's refugee population and one refugee agency solely for Palestinians.
Which is
There
also
is
a different definition of what a refugee is.
Yes, of course, because it has a different agency. The agency is the one that's allowed to define what makes a refugee. All true. There is this fixation. Does it come from anti-Semitism? Does it not? You and I have argued about this many times. I'm not going to get into the whole argument here. I am not sure that the origins of this is, I'll at least say, solely anti-Semitism, but also the way I at least treat the ongoing conflict is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If the reason, let's say that I'll say your side, quote unquote, that this originates more from anti-Semitism is true, and therefore the International Court of Justice is going to prosecute Israel, the ICC, the International Criminal Court is going to prosecute Netanyahu. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, those are still facts. They are
Yeah.
facts, and they
Yeah,
and they have an impact on the war, and
yeah.
that's what I'm care about.
Yeah, I would say more, and we don't need to harp on this, so we'll get on. I would say it's almost more, let's say 1,000 people jaywalk every single day, and police are only giving tickets to Black people who jaywalk. At the end of the day, they're still punishing a punishable crime by giving a ticket. On the other hand, if you look at the statistics, you say, okay, why is 90% of jaywalking tickets only going? So that's sort of how I see the ICC and UN. They're not wrong, but it is sort of that analogy. If you want to move on, we can move on
Let's
here.
move on.
Okay, so the other big question that I had is questions around Iran, because just to unpack for listeners, I believe it was April or May, you probably know the exact date, where you had this back and forth, the ballistic missile shot by Iran, the Israeli retaliation. A couple of weeks later, the president of Iran mysteriously went missing. Who knows if that was Israel or not? My words, not yours. And then I haven't seen much about Iran the last couple of months. I mean, it just hasn't been in the news. There were, a couple of days after those ballistic missiles, CNN and Fox and, the BBC were saying, World War III might be brewing. And it seems like that situation has cooled off. Is that just the media not talking about it as much? Has it actually cooled off? Is any direct strike to and from Iran sort of off the table? Or, what would you say about the big picture Iran right now?
So just to put some order into the facts, Iran has been sponsoring different militias in the Middle East. Hezbollah is by far the biggest one. After them are the Houthis in Yemen, and then there's dozens, not hundreds, of others spread throughout Iraq, Syria, some in Jordan, et cetera, that have been very active in the war. Most of them actually started attacking U.S. interests rather than Israeli interests already in late October. So Iran has been involved in the war since the beginning. What happened is on April 1st, throughout March, Israel upped the game in terms of the fact that it started targeting Iranian officials in Syria and in Lebanon, very high-ranking officials. On April 1st, it bombed out a consulate building of Iran, killing the most top-ranking Revolutionary Guard general in charge of Syria and Lebanon. This was seen by Iran. It was said this is an attack on Iranian soil, as far as we're concerned. And therefore, 2 weeks later, they launched over 350 projectiles. It was ballistic missiles, it was cruise missiles, it was drones. And then there was the Israeli retaliation. One of the things that are important to observe is that, seemingly at least, both Israel and Iran have a vested interest in the situation not spiraling. They both like to talk big about how they're going to destroy each other, but factually, they don't. This was the first time, first of all, in history that Iran openly attacked Israel. I could tell that's only been through proxies. So despite all the rhetoric from the last 40, 50 years, nothing. And even the way that happened, Iran's retaliation, I would argue, was very much designed to let the situation spiral down. Yes, what they sent hundreds of projectiles to let it spiral down. Yes, it took those projectiles 8 hours to get there. Iran is not dumb when it comes to military. A lot can be said about Iran. They're not dumb. If they wanted to launch an attack on Israel, they would not launch missiles that literally I was doing news interviews, speaking, saying, look, they're on their way. They're going to be there in 5 hours. They're going to be there in 4 hours. If I knew where they were, conceivably the Israeli military and the American military and the other countries that participated in shooting them down, from Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar reportedly. So that was meant as a retaliation to save face, to say we did something, but not really to cause a lot of damage in Israel. Similarly, the Israeli retaliation, Israel never took responsibility for it. It was a retaliation that was done very much to send a message, targeted the air defenses around Iran's nuclear facilities in Natanz, and in addition to that, it was reportedly launched from within Iran. So it was Mossad agents that are in Iran that had drones that were able to do that. That was all meant to send a message. Since then, one Israeli minister seemingly accidentally took responsibility for it. But the fact that Israel also took responsibility for it is a way to say we can spiral it down. We're not now escalating towards full-on war. The president, Ibrahim Raisi, was killed in a helicopter crash on May 19th. No one has even suggested that's Israel. Not Iran, not the Mossad. If anyone thought that it was, they would have no problem saying that.
Just some crazy rabbi on a podcast. No, I'm not. I mean, reading about the history of the Mossad. I mean, again, you can just say I'm insane right now, and I don't even necessarily believe this, but here is the case. There were a couple interesting analyses that I read. It would be in Iran's best interest to deny that it was Israel if it was Israel, because acknowledging it would have basically forced their hand into an open war. Same with Israel. So it could have been just a stronger signal of don't mess with us. Again, if I was a betting man, I wouldn't bet on it, but I also wouldn't be shocked if in 20 years after this was declassified, all of a sudden it comes out that it might have been Israel. Either way, I cut you off there.
Could be. I don't think that it was. I think that I certainly think that Israel was very happy to see him go. There were recently elections in Iran. A more reformist president has been elected. I mean, it's within the purview of who's allowed to run in Iran, so reformist is obviously taken with an asterisk, but nonetheless, compared to Ibrahim Raisi, so yes, of course, in Israel they were happy about it. But as it seems right now, the situation has spiraled down because both sides had an interest in it spiraling down. That said, the situation between Israel and Hezbollah is escalating exponentially in the last 2 months. And should that break out, that is going to force Iran back into the fold again, in terms of getting involved.
Yeah, so let's just do a little bit of a moratorium on Hezbollah in terms of, I don't know how much you want to delve into the history and their ideology. Are they able to operate? I guess the pointed question I want to ask, and then maybe you can introduce who exactly they are and how they're different than Iran. Are they allowed to act as separate than Iran for the purposes of the skirmish boiling over? Meaning, if Hezbollah shoots everything they have at Israel, which of course they haven't, they've also been holding off, and hopefully I'll address that as well. Is Israel allowed to then go to Iran and say this is basically a declaration of war between Israel and Iran, or is Hezbollah still considered its own entity, even as it's funded and connected and even trained by the Iranian government? And where exactly is the line drawn there?
So I'll start from your last point, and then I'll go back to who is Hezbollah. If Hezbollah were to, declare open war instead of right now is a very low level skirmishes between the sides as far as all their firepower is, um, technically Israel would not be able to. You ask, like, could they go and demand, retribution from Iran legally by the rules of war, international law? No. This is the same thing as during the Cold War, right? You had proxies, so if you had, different groups that were armed by the Soviet Union that would attack U.S. interests throughout the world, could the United States go and attack the Soviet Union in response? Technically, no, even though everyone knows that this is the Soviet Union doing that. Yes, but you can't go and declare war. You could, of course, declare war and go to war, but that's the reason to set up proxies is because that you don't have to be accountable. That you could have things going on, but usually it doesn't come back to you. So realistically speaking, if Hezbollah were to launch all-out war, chances are Israel would not retaliate against Iran because then the Iranian army would be involved. Even on October 8th, when the war was just spiraling and everyone was afraid that Hezbollah was going to join, the United States sent two aircraft carriers into the region, and they threatened Hezbollah, but they didn't even threaten Iran. They threatened Hezbollah and said if Hezbollah launches the war, they're going to retaliate against Syria, against the Assad regime, just because they knew that this would piss off Iran and would piss off this. But Syria doesn't have the army to actually engage the way Iran does. So chances are Iran would not bear the brunt of if Hezbollah were to go into the war unless they joined themselves. One. Now, in terms of who is Hezbollah, very briefly, Hezbollah was established in 1982 after Israel, or during, but really after Israel invaded southern Lebanon as in retaliation to the PLO carrying out a lot of violent activity from southern Lebanon against Israel. It was established by Iran. The revolution in Iran occurred in 1979, and part of the revolution was exporting militant Shiite Islam. Lebanon is a very, very divided country, lots of different ethnicities. The Shiites mostly live in the south. Historically, they have been oppressed. It's very low-hanging fruit for Iran to pour a lot of money into that region and radicalize it. That is what happened with Hezbollah. One of the interesting things that happened, though, is starting in 1992 and taking off more in 1996, is Hezbollah formed a political party in Lebanon and started running in politics. And Hezbollah is divided much more than other terrorist organizations. Hezbollah is divided between its political wing and the military wing. They work together. They all report to the same leader, but unlike, for example, Hamas, where the political wing, is someone who, by night could go and have a lot to do with the military wing, and then by day go report to the ministry in the government. In Hezbollah, you have full-time politicians, people who have never held a gun, have nothing to do with anything, and they are running in politics alongside the military establishment of Hezbollah. So because of that, Hezbollah is in a relatively unique position. On the one hand, it is completely loyal to Iran, much more than other militias, more than the Houthis, more than the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a lot of groups that are loyal to Iran. Hezbollah is much more loyal. Ideologically, all their funding comes from Iran, their trading comes from Iran, they have Iranian officials there. They could not launch something without Iran's okay. That is something they could not do on the one hand. On the other hand, they are also bound to Lebanese politics. And in that sense, they're very different than the Houthis, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Kataib Hezbollah, which is a big organization in Syria. They have a responsibility to the people of Lebanon, not only because they are Lebanese and feel close to them, because there will be elections in Lebanon again. In Lebanon, there is a lot of anger with Hezbollah over the fact that right now the south is completely destroyed. There's a lot of people in Lebanon. The Lebanese prime minister have all said, we don't want this war. Why are you dragging us into this war? And because Hezbollah is also a political party, not just a militia, they actually care about what the voters think. So, in that sense, they could not launch anything without Iran's approval, but they also have internal Lebanese politics to
Yeah,
consider.
this is the strangest thing about Lebanon, and maybe you can help clear this up a little bit. So they are a normative political party in the sense that there will be elections at some point, and if they lose some seats, they will have less political power over the legislative and whatever branch within the country. Yet every time they fire a rocket, they are not doing that on behalf of Lebanon
Lebanon.
government, Lebanese people. Is the Lebanese government able to stop them? Is there any internal crackdown? I mean, not that you can compare this to, America or Israel, but there'd be no situation where a separate militia can be bombing, say, Mexico from California, and the California government sort of says, well, we don't love this, but like what is the internal mechanism there? Why is there not the Lebanese army or Lebanese police force trying to, raid Hezbollah strongholds and say, hey, you are not allowed to fire drones and missiles at Israel without our permission? I mean, what is happening there?
So this is where Iran plays a crucial role because the Hezbollah forces are actually far more well funded and trained than the Lebanese army. And this is where, imagine, for example, that Lebanon is in bankruptcy. Lebanon has undergone 90% inflation. It's had a really tough 15 years. They had a lot of crises that happened internally. Half of Lebanon was also occupied by Syria until the half of the first decade of the 21st century. And then they've undergone a lot of problems. The Lebanese government is not that functional. They've had a political deadlock for a long time. Meanwhile, Hezbollah is fully funded, fully operational, fully trained, weapons smuggling nonstop. Hezbollah is actually quite a bit stronger than the Lebanese army in a lot of ways. Not necessarily in manpower, but in terms of training, in terms of fuel. Like when there was a fuel crisis in Lebanon, Hezbollah's gas stations were full and Lebanon's were empty. So in that sense, imagine, for example, a complete political crisis in the United States where the military and the National Guard are very underfunded and don't always report to work. Meanwhile, you had a militia in California that every now and then would fire missiles at Mexico. Now, should the government of California risk internal civil war without enough forces to try to stop this militia, or should they say, that's Mexico's problem? I'm not saying what's ethical, right or wrong. I'm saying
Yeah, yeah,
factually,
go for it.
Lebanon usually leaves it at the point of, okay, we'd rather this doesn't happen and we're terrified of Israel's response, but that's the situation. Right now, there's this constant diplomatic effort by the United States and France and Germany to try to spiral down the situation. Most of the deals that have been proposed have actually been accepted, both by the government of Israel and by the government of Lebanon. The deals are that Hezbollah will pull north, the Lebanese army will deploy 15,000 soldiers along the border, which Israel trusts and Lebanon would trust, and that there would be negotiations between the country for 10 days on different border disputes. There's only one thing: Hezbollah hasn't agreed to this. And there's no one who can force it within Lebanon. And if Israel forces it, then it's going to be an entire game changer. So Hezbollah would need to agree. Lebanon does not have the capability of actually forcing them back. That's the stalemate right now. Lebanon does not have the capability. If Israel were to invade, it will radicalize a lot of the Lebanese and would not help the situation. Foreign forces, understandably, don't want to send their own troops to do this. So it's a complete stalemate, which ironically leaves us in the hands of Hezbollah deciding, are they going to stop the war, start the war? Do they agree to go back or not?
Well, this is always the problem with extremists, is that a lot of times, normative political institutions, and this is also true in America, are sort of beholden to the extremists because, if you're a one issue ideologue, then you almost have a lot more sway in a normative political situation than, somebody who's thinking about a multiplicity of things. I assume, and maybe you know about this, maybe you don't, that Israel is undercover trying to sow, plant the seeds almost of civil war within Lebanon. I mean, as horrible as that would be from a humanitarian point of view, I imagine Israel would welcome a civil war in Lebanon right now, in terms of, having the Hezbollah militia really reduced or weakened by the Lebanese government and perhaps even the majority of the Lebanese people.
I'm not sure. I mean, I will say I have no insider information on what
Okay.
Israel's doing, um, but I'm not sure that Israel would actually benefit from that. Um, right now, because of the stalemate, Hezbollah is still also stuck. It also does not launch complete war. Israel has warned that what's happened in Han Yunis and what happened in Sajaiya and Gaza City, that'll be the fate of Beirut. Because of that, there's a lot of pressure within the Lebanese government on Hezbollah to not launch a war. If civil war breaks out, that pressure is gone. There's going to be no more elections. There's going to be internal fighting. Once there's internal fighting, there's also no reason for Hezbollah to not launch more raids right now. There's no reason for other groups that there's Amal, there's lots of other militias in Lebanon to not launch their own raids against Israel because there's no internal structures anymore that would stop them. And with anarchy, hey, you never know. Maybe I'll come off the hero who managed to fire at an IDF base and kill some soldiers, and maybe then my stock will go up in a civil war. So I'm not sure that Israel would actually benefit as a result of a civil war. We saw this also in Syria when Syria broke down. Sure, if Assad had been overthrown, maybe this would have been good for Israel. But factually, there's not been peace between Israel and Syria, yet the last fighting that ever occurred between the sides was 1973. And since then, there's been a cold stalemate, and that's just fine. Civil war breaks out, all of a sudden, there's militias on the border. All of a sudden, people are firing rockets at the Golan Heights because when there's anarchy, there's no one to stop that either. So
Although on the
Israel would not
flip
necessarily
side,
benefit.
the country of Syria in the 60s and 70s, they were put together enough to actually wage a serious war against Israel. Now they're not anymore, right? So just to take the other side, obviously militias firing rockets, that's bad. We don't want that. But in terms of the ability of the country of Syria to ever present a serious, existential threat to Israel, that's basically off the table.
Yeah, but again, we've had 50 years from 1973, until now. Okay, maybe the Syrian civil war, but 40 years where Syria did not mount a threat because Assad cared more about his regime. The minute the country collapses, ISIS could have taken over. If Russia had not come in and saved Assad's regime, ISIS would have probably taken over there. Having a Taliban style regime in Syria is not going to be good for the Jewish state either. So
Yeah.
like a civil war is rolling the dice, and you really don't know what's going to happen, especially in the Middle East. I mean, look at Arab Spring. Like
Right.
civil war, a lot of people are often optimistic, thinking, okay, good, we're going to wipe the state clean and start over. Does not always produce better things.
Fair. So you mentioned something before, which is something I know that we've talked about, just to explicitate it for listeners. You mentioned that Israel is implicitly signaling to Hezbollah and really the Lebanese people that Beirut can become Khan Yunis. Just to unpack that for listeners, Khan Yunis is obviously in Gaza, one of the areas that was a Hamas stronghold. It's basically leveled now, probably be inhabitable for at least a generation. One of my theories, and I've run this by you, and you haven't really accepted the theory, but you seem to imply it yourself, is that part of the reason why Israel is hitting Gaza so hard, they're saying it's because they're trying to defeat Hamas. We both, I think, agree that this elusive goal of defeating Hamas is sort of meaningless, right? We can unpack that question in a second and explain why to listeners. I'm convinced at least half of it is signaling to Lebanon and Hezbollah, hey, we are not afraid to take it a step further than we've done previously being attacked. What do you think about that claim? You had seemed to imply it with Beirut. Do you think that holds water? I mean, the flip side of the coin, almost the inverse of this, is that if it wasn't for Hezbollah on the border, I think Israel would have stopped the Gaza war a long time ago. I'm curious if you agree with that final claim, and just I'll throw that back to you.
So we have talked about this. I don't think that Israel, if we're talking like cold hard analysis, I don't think that Israel would need to do what it did in Gaza to signal this to Lebanon. I mean, Israel already in 2006 leveled large parts of Bin Jbel. There's what became known as the Dahya Doctrine, which was the fact that Dahya was in a neighborhood that was razed to the ground, flattened, carpet bombed, because rockets were being fired from there, and Israel openly announced the next time there's a war with Lebanon, we're going to employ the Dahya doctrine. So I really don't think that this would be like that would be A, necessary, B, again, if we're looking at it from just an objective point of view, the more carnage there is in Gaza, the more it's also like infuriating a lot of elements in the Middle East. I'm not saying this is justified, not justified. I'm saying factually, I'm not sure this is like, do that to deter others. Hezbollah knows. Hezbollah knows this very well. Any militia, Hamas knows that they can't defeat Israel in face-to-face battle, which is one of the reasons that they're hiding in tunnels and one of the reasons that they're now calling for ceasefire. So I'm not sure that this actually would have been necessary. And I would seriously challenge the notion that if not for Hezbollah, Israel would have declared the war over. This is something we've talked about a while ago. Um, the fact is that right now the war is also being dragged on because of this elusive defeating Hamas, but also because of internal politics. Internal politics within Israel, internal politics within Hamas, within the Palestinian Authority. So all of those dynamics are playing a much bigger factor. Um, I would almost argue on the contrary. Israel would love to end the situation in Gaza so that it could then turn its attention north. Because internally, Israel has a problem, right? The situation in Gaza right now is a stalemate. It's probably going to be a stalemate for, I would even say, decades. I mean, who knows how it's going to play out. But right now, the northern part of Israel is in ruins. There are, between 60 and 100,000 people who are evacuated now over 9 months. Entire businesses are destroyed, and they can't return because it's a war zone. Israel would love to show Hezbollah, hey, we're done with them now. Guess what? We now have a lot more pilots and a lot more weaponry, a lot more tanks available to go up north. So I'm not sure that it's because of the situation up north that Israel's not ending the situation in Gaza. Almost on the contrary, to some extent, I would
Yeah.
say.
No, it is interesting, but although, I mean, just to wrap another layer of complexity, Hezbollah has said many times they are determining what they are going to do based off of what happens in Gaza.
Yes.
Whether or not we take their word for that, that's maybe a separate question. But from Hezbollah's perspective, at least if we trust a lot of what they're messaging publicly, which, see our conversation from 20 minutes ago on whether or not to trust that or not. If Israel did announce tomorrow, unilateral ceasefire, presumably Hezbollah would stop launching rockets. Now, it doesn't mean in 3 years from now something else wouldn't flare up.
No, on the contrary, that's exactly. I do trust them, by the way, that is what they would do because to them that would be ultimate victory. Look, we for 9 months pummeled the north, burned most of it down. We made Israel evacuate all its civilians. Israel did not invade Lebanon in order to stop us. And we decided when they stopped the war in Gaza, now we're done. Let's see you start the war in Gaza again. Let's see you. And exactly as you said, and we have that capability always another few years. I think Hezbollah probably would do that because that would be seen as the ultimate victory for them. They chose when to start. They chose when to stop. Israel did not force them to do anything. So, in that sense, I do think that like they probably would live up to that statement at least.
Yeah, they also, I mean, this might be just sort of a little bit out of left field. You mentioned this a little bit before with Iran and some of the public messaging. There's such hyperbole from these groups. I mean, granted, I genuinely do think Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, we could throw ISIS in there. They genuinely do want to see Israel razed to the ground and, probably all the Jews there killed, sure. But there seems to be the hyperbole doesn't match their actions. I mean, like, if they really wanted to do this, I mean, if tomorrow Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, and Hamas just threw everything they had out of at Israel, there might be a chance that Israel would be, I mean, it would be interesting to see, America politically is sort of in disarray. There were just new elections in France and Britain, they're a little bit in disarray right now. But it just seems that they talk such a big game and there's no follow through. I mean, it almost strikes me. I mean, in some way, I'm thinking of Donald Trump and just some of the things that he says of, we're going to build the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. And then they don't build the wall and Mexico doesn't pay for the little bit of a wall they build. And then he goes and, campaigns on 2024 on, we built the wall. It's like, no, you didn't, right? Is this just what's happening there? Is it a cultural thing that, people in America just don't understand?
So I'll say two things. One, um, from the perspective they're linked. From the perspective of this relates to like research I've done on comparing secular terrorism and religious terrorism. From the perspective of religious terrorism, time matters a lot less. There was an interview that was done by Mark Durgesmeyer, actually my former supervisor, with one of the leaders of Hamas back in the 90s. And he was saying, like, exactly what you're saying, like, yeah, but you're not going to do this. Like, you're not gonna succeed in defeating so like what with your back in the 90s, like with your several hundred people, like you're going to break down the IDF that the different Arab armies couldn't do. And the person looked at him and said, yeah, it may take 200 or 300 years. That's how long it took to defeat the Crusaders. I mean, the perception for religious when you're fighting a religious holy war, you're fighting for God. It's timeless. It's not the same thing. It's not the same perceptions as when you're fighting a nationalistic secular war that like you need to show results. Here, the perception is, yeah, how long did it take to defeat the Crusaders? Okay, so it took 200 years till we had our warrior. Okay, so be it. So first of all, there is that fact that like it doesn't matter how dire it looks, and you see this, by the way, again, as someone who's studied this, like you see this in the texts and the analyses of religious actors anywhere from the Lord's Resistance Army, they're actually Christian, in Uganda to the Lashkar Taiba in Kashmir, the Muslims. I mean, religious actors have a different perception of time, and therefore how dire it looks, it doesn't matter because God is going to prevail in the end. So that's one. But two, on the much more practical level, Hamas is proving to you that you're wrong. Hamas is established in 1988. Since 1988 until now, we're not talking about that long. And the group not only managed to play, at least I'll say, a very vital role in destroying the Oslo process, making sure that there was no two-state solution, because as far as they're concerned, that's not good. They then managed to win Palestinian elections in 2006. That tells you how quickly they managed to actually get into the hearts and minds of people. Since 2009, there were major flare ups with Israel in 2009, 12, 14, 18, 21, and now. Each and every time, the group got stronger. You can track this. Each and every time, their rockets and missiles went further. Each and every time, they managed to inflict more damage. The first rockets that Hamas sent was in 2001. It had a range of 2 miles. Now their rockets get all the way to Haifa and some of them get close to go down to Eilat. They have proven that they are actually building more and more each time. See October 7th. So yes, it's true that like they're not like, why don't you throw everything that you have and destroy? But if you look at it from the long game perspective, they're proving that they are building and building and building and building. I was asked what did they want to achieve in October 7th, and that's a whole other question.
Yeah.
Because October 7th did not go the way they planned for a lot of reasons. It actually was far more successful than they planned. This is according to their
Yeah, yeah.
own internal documents. Um, and I said mostly what they wanted, in my opinion, is to make a bid to show that they're still alive and well, to release Palestinian prisoners so that they could take over the West Bank. That's their next goal. The next goal is not destruction of Israel. That's a long goal. Next goal is take over the West Bank in order to march on further. That was what they wanted. So, are they trying to destroy Israel? I would argue yes, they are, but just in a much longer game perspective. And same goes with Hezbollah. The Houthis actually don't care that much about Israel. They just wanted to also like save face and be part of the game.
Well, that's a
They'd
little
love to
bit.
see Israel destroyed, but like they're not. They'd love to see Israel destroyed, but they're not going to do much more about it. I'll say that.
Sure. Yeah, no, that is very interesting. I will also just add, I mean, every time, I was thinking a lot about, obviously, been reflecting a lot about October 7th and the military significance. Of course, the tragedy, for Israel, yes, doesn't need to be mentioned every time. In some sense, though, I mean, obviously it was a success beyond what Hamas could have imagined. On the other hand, it almost, from another perspective, could show how futile them thinking they're ever going to destroy Israel is. I mean, this is the best chance they ever got. They caught Israel blindfolded with their pants down, and they were able to hold, some cities for a couple of hours. And so, I mean, again, I granted, I know what you're saying. Every year you're building up. Israel is, of course, also building up. One of the things that was not on my bingo card this year is, Saudi Arabia shooting down, Iranian missiles. And so they must also see the flip side of every year that Israel doesn't get destroyed, it becomes stronger and more developed and more anchored into the wider sort of globalistic Western world. And so there is a little bit of a ticking clock because, say, in the 60s and 70s, it was a lot sort of I don't even know if this is going to come across, reasonable, but it was a lot more normative to imagine that a country would come and go. I mean, in the 40s, how many different nation states, were founded and started. Now I don't really know what it looks like for a nation state to disappear, especially one that's aligned with the West. And so unless, I mean, again, now you might say that their actually long-term goal is not just the overthrowing of Israel, it's the entire Western world and everything there. But it does seem like the goal does not match up with what they're actually doing. But again, we can,
But again,
come.
all I would say is, you don't know what it's going to look like in 20 years. Look back 20 years ago in 2004. 2004, you had still Yasser Arafat. Okay, he died in 2004, so he was still alive for some of it. Palestinian Authority controlled parts of the Gaza Strip, and parts of the West Bank. Israel still had its settlements in the Gaza Strip, where the height of Second Intifada. Tell me that in 20 years from now, Hamas launches October 7th and is able to hold 120 captives right now for 9 months. Israel is throwing everything it has into Gaza, and Gaza, just for listeners, is about the size of a quarter of Los Angeles, and is not able to take over all of Gaza in 9 months. Israel's strongest army in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. Tell me that 20 years ago. So that's all I'm saying is Hamas is saying, yeah, that's fine. All you're saying is true. Talk to me in 20 years. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but that's their
We'll
perspective.
have to do another episode in 20 years. We've been talking for about an hour. It's a lot of fun, always playing the devil's advocate with you from all positions. I did have questions about both internal Israeli and internal American politics. Is there anything you want to say? I mean, I'll throw it to you. I mean, I don't even have to ask anything specific. Is there anything that you think listeners should know that we haven't discussed before we get, bogged down? And there's a lot of other interesting questions. Maybe we'll save that for another episode this summer. But what else should listeners know? If you haven't been paying any attention for the last 6 weeks, or you're looking forward to the next couple of weeks, what should people be looking for?
So specifically because you asked about internal politics, I'll say what I keep on telling people when they ask, like, why is Netanyahu doing this, or why would Hamas leadership, external leadership, be doing that, or the Democratic Party doing this or that? Ultimately, everyone has an ideology, but the tactical levels of how people are operating during the war are entirely linked to internal politics. And so people also have to be looking at that. In Israel right now, today, on July 9th, the government is in complete turmoil, and different coalition partners are threatening to overthrow the government. You'd think because of the war, you'd think because of hostages, you think this, because of an internal law that has to do with how you elect rabbis to different positions in different cities. That is what's going to threaten to overthrow the government.
Okay.
There's the
The
big
careers of
deal.
rabbis is a very important issue.
Well, I know you may have more to say about this than me, but also like the drafting of ultra orthodox boys is the big next thing that may overthrow the government. So that determines a lot of how Israel operates during the war, even though it has nothing to do with the war. Similarly, Hamas, is it going to accept a hostage deal, not accept a hostage deal? There is internal political struggles in Hamas between the external leadership of Ismail Haniyeh and Khalid Mashal and other figures, and the internal leadership of Yahya Sinwar, Muhammad Def. They have disagreements, and that determines very often how they're operating during the war. American politics, seeing the elections coming up, how the Democratic Party is going to operate versus how the Republican Party is going to operate, and how that's going to influence the war has much more to do with internal politics, right? Again, there is ideology, obviously, but the tactical levels have to do with internal politics. So very often look to that also when you try to see, okay, but what is Hamas going to accept this? Is Israel going to accept this? Will the United States pressure them? What's happening internally within each of these actors will often explain to you why they're operating the way they're operating. That's what I would advise looking at.
Yeah, and at some point later this summer, I'm going to have to do an episode about the 2024 election in Israel. I mean, there's so many wild cards out there. It's impossible to know exactly. I mean, one, just even in the broad sense of if you care about general pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, policy, who will actually be better. I mean, it's just so obfuscated right now in terms of who
Very
believes
much.
what for what reason. And, obviously there is a growing voice now in the far right. I've been seeing a lot on Twitter the last couple of days. There's been a couple of viral tweets by, far right American isolationist actors that are basically starting to give Israel the same treatment they're giving Ukraine, which,
Right.
just a little bit of listeners' background, is there's some strange isolationist ideology on the far right that I think would make, any Republican from the 70s and 80s roll in their grave, that has become almost de facto pro-Putin and pro-Russia. and they think that Ukraine is just there to sort of siphon money off of the, good, hardworking American people. This is by no means a majority position in the Republican Party, but it certainly is a growing sentiment. And I'm seeing a lot of that start to carry over to Israel and discussions of Israel.
Yeah.
I interviewed actually the Republican nominee for Congress, Scott Baugh, a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him on that question, and he didn't bite. He basically said he's not worried at all about that section of the Republican Party, at least vis-a-vis Congress. I'm a little bit more skeptical, so that is a fascinating story to look out for. Obviously, on the far left, listeners, of course, know who in Congress is going to strike down any Israel aid bill, but that is what I will be looking for. Dr. Alon Burstein, thank you so much for chatting.
Daniel, great to see you.